Greetings, Herle Burlyites, and welcome to the only political podcast in Canada where the host and this week's guest can answer questions like, why does Pigskin Pete wear that bowler hat? Was Ray Elgaard a more clutch second down receiver than Tony Gabriel or Peter Dalla-Riva? And who struck more fear into opposing quarterbacks? The late, great Angelo Mosca, Joe Montford, or Grover Covington? All right, we got a hell of a show for you today. My guest is Steve Paikin. Not that Steve needs any introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He's a journalist, an author, a documentary producer, and the anchor of TVO's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda. Steve's also my good friend, and as a lifelong Ticats fan, I think he'd be an excellent choice for Grand Marshal of the Grey Cup Festival Parade this year in Hamilton. Except that they're not having a Grey Cup Parade this year, as far as I can tell. We're going to talk about two broad subjects today. Ontario politics. We'll break down the leaders' prospects for the upcoming spring election, plus all the other goings and dugophonalia you can handle. And why my Riders are going to upset the Blue Bombers this weekend and then go on to beat the crap out of the Ticats in the 108th Grey Cup on December 12th.
Yeah.
Steve Paikin, damn good to have you here on the Herle Burly. Are you feeling good?
Thanks for that super introduction. That was just, it was going so well until you got to the very end there. And then it kind of fell off the table, but whatever.
Hey, how are you, man? I have not seen you in person. I've not seen you even like this, but I've not seen you in person since the Liberal Leadership Convention, the weekend before the world went to shit in the spring of 2020. I'm still amazed that wasn't a super spreader event. There was thousands of people in there, unmasked, hugging, right? I was sitting next to you, very close proximity for a long time. Neither one of us made the other say.
Yeah, that's true. And my recollection of that convention is two things. Number one, Stephen Del Duca won on the first ballot, one going away. It wasn't close. And the second thing was I didn't shake hands with a single person that day except Stephen Del Duca when he came into the makeshift studio that we had for a post-convention interview. I shook his hand, and then immediately I put a dollop of that grease in his hand and a dollop of the grease in my hand, Purell, whatever it was. And we washed our hands immediately right away and then had our interview. But yeah, you're right. It's been a long time. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you. Hey, we're like almost 2 years into this thing now, and now it seems like it isn't over when I had thought it was over. How are you feeling? What's your state of mind in this point in time?
Not bad, all things considered. My wife and I did have COVID, despite the fact that we were both double vaxxed. We got it. We got a bit of a nasty dose of it, I must say. She lost her sense of smell and taste for quite a while. I'll put the obligatory line in here right now.
She had lost her sense of taste a long time ago.
There we go. I was going to try to do it before you got there, but you beat me to it. Okay. Yep, that is quite true. I can tell you, you don't want COVID. You really don't want it, despite the double vaxxing. It really knocked the crap out of me for a bit, but no lingering effects, thank goodness. I do know people who've got what they call long COVID, which, the effects of which stay with them for a long time.
Yeah.
But all things considered, David, nothing to complain about. Like you, I'm one of those lucky people who's been able to keep working throughout, and my kids are fine, so away we go.
And you're not in the studio though, right? You're working from home?
We are back in the studio as of September, but we certainly spent probably 2/3 of the last 19 months hosting the show from my attic. Which, a real testament to our technical people that they were able to figure out very quickly how to put a light in here, how to put a fancy microphone in here, how to put a fancy camera in here, and enable me to do all that. We've only had, I think, though, 3 guests in the studio. All the other interviews take place like this, where I'm talking to boxes, which is a very, don't take this the wrong way, but it's a very unsatisfying way to do an interview when you're accustomed to sitting 2 feet away from somebody.
No question.
Real hard to get any chemistry going through boxes, but it's better than nothing. So we've been on the air the whole time and doing our jobs, I hope, reasonably well.
Okay, well, let's try to be better than nothing.
I think we can reach that bar.
Okay. First and most importantly, our 2 teams are on a collision course for the Grey Cup.
I hope so.
With only a couple of speed bumps in the way this weekend, in the form of the Toronto Argonauts and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. What do you think about your Tiger Cats?
Not much, actually. This was a season Well, put it this way, because the Grey Cup is in Hamilton this year, of course, there's been a ton of pressure on the Tiger Cats to be great, so that for the first time since 1972, and I was at that game. Do you remember the final score of that game, David? Let me think for a second.
13-10. Ian Sunter, do this. And Tony Gabriel was a factor in both that and 76. I hate that bastard. I've talked about him personally.
Yes. Well, your memory is good.
Yeah.
Your memory is good. Yes, Hamilton beat Saskatchewan 13-10 in that Grey Cup game in 1972. But Hamilton hasn't hosted a Grey Cup game since 72. And everybody from Hamilton's really hoping it's going to happen this year. And it got off to such a great start. And then they went into a terrible slump midway through the season. Last week, they played well. They did beat Montreal. Or should I say the defense beat Montreal. The offense hasn't shown up yet, David, and I'm very concerned about that. And if the offense has the same kind of display next week against the Argos that they had last week against Montreal, we're going to lose. Your game, on the other hand, was phenomenal. I came home from the Ticat game. I watched the Western game, and holy smokes, was that exciting. You must have been over the moon.
Yeah, it was a great game. In terms of your team, your offense, I saw Brandon Banks on the sideline saying, just give me the ball. Just give me the ball.
Well, that's good advice, actually. Maybe they should do that.
I think the Riders were actually very similar. I don't think the Rider offense is great at all. Fajardo finds a way to win games, but he's not an elite quarterback. Their offensive line is awful, but they've got a championship defense for sure and pretty good special teams. So Winnipeg's formidable. They've certainly dominated us twice this year, but I feel, as you must, if you're a Rider fan, optimistic.
Well, you certainly can be happy about the fact that Calgary's kicker missed 3 field goals. That might have had a little something to do with your victory last week. And it's hard to win a game when you throw 4 interceptions, which I think Fajardo did, but yeah. Saskatchewan found a way. So good for you. We actually have lots of. Why
are you trash talking us? Didn't Montreal's quarterback fumble 3 times or something like that?
Well, because of the pressure put on him by the intense Angelo Mosca inspired Tiger Cat defense. Yes, indeed. But we have other reasons for feeling good this morning, and that is your hockey club fired its general manager, and my hockey club is playing great. So that's all to the better.
Yeah, your team could win the Stanley Cup this year.
Oh God, stop it. Don't do that. How about we win a round? Let's win a first round, first time in 17 years. That'd be good.
You wouldn't be happy with that. They could win the Stanley Cup. My team may someday be different than it is today. That's all I know out of yesterday's news. Well, yeah. Anyway, the Grey Cup is in Hamilton in a couple of weeks. Very, very exciting event. You know, Steve, the Western Final drew 1.1 million viewers on television. Western semifinal drew 1.1 million, and the Eastern Final drew 700,000 in English on TSN. So probably 1 million when you add in RDS. Where are those people in the stands, Steve?
I don't know how many times.
People have the impression that nobody cares about the CFL in Canada, but 1 million people is a lot of people.
Oh yeah, I'm not under the impression that nobody likes the CFL in Canada. I am definitely under the impression that people like the CFL. But I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation with people when I say, I'm going to the game this weekend. I've got an extra ticket. Who wants to come with me? And you hear crickets. It's very tough to find people to want to go to games. And when you ask them why, they say that the television experience now is so fabulous. And of course, I guess a lot of people we know have these really big TV sets with all the sis boom ba that in their judgment, it's a better experience than being there. That's certainly not the case for me. I will always, always, always choose to be there, including sitting there freezing my arse off last week as I did, but it was for a great cause, David. It was for a great cause.
Absolutely. Okay, before we piss people off too much, let's talk about politics. We're about 6 months out from an Ontario election. There have been a few polls out recently. They all seem to say roughly the same thing. Ford PC's in the lead, all 3 parties within 10 points of each other. Ballpark, right?
Yep.
How do you handicap it?
Well, I don't. That's not my business. That's the business of other people. And in fact, I try very hard not to do that because I don't want to spend the next 6 months reporting on, analyzing, events that I have already in my head sort of decided, well, here's how it's likely going to work out.
Right.
I learned 31 years ago when a fellow by the name of Bob Ray shocked everybody by coming out of nowhere to win a majority government that there's not a lot of marks in handicapping this thing, and therefore don't waste your time trying to do it. I'm going to let it unfold, David. I'm just going to let it unfold. I'm going to try to understand it. I'm going to try to help people understand it, those who watch our TV program or read the newsletter or listen to the podcast or whatever. So I feel no obligation to handicap it.
Ford, that makes sense from a journalist's perspective, to be honest. Ford didn't have a platform really in the last election. Mm-hmm. He jettisoned his closest advisor after about a year in office and changed up his government pretty substantially. Then COVID hit, and we've been dealing with COVID ever since. What is the Ford government about? What are they there to do?
I think Doug Ford is one of the most interesting examples of a political pivot I've ever seen in my life. And by that, I mean, this was it. Let's just, for some of your listeners who don't follow this as carefully as you and I do, let's remember that in January of 2018, Doug Ford thought he was going to be running for mayor of Toronto against John Tory again. And had he done so, he probably would have lost again. And his political career might very well have been over. And then the Progressive Conservative Party had a bit of a scandal, and they jettisoned their leader, and they had a leadership convention. And 3 months later, Doug Ford's the leader. And 3 months after that, he's the premier. Now, that's pretty amazing. Okay, so he comes into office, and I don't say this to be critical. I think it's just accurate. He comes into office as the 26th premier of Ontario with probably as few qualifications for that job as anybody who's had that office, maybe save and except for Ernest Drury, who was the head of the United Farmers of Ontario, who, when the farmers won the election in 1919, didn't even have a leader. They picked Drury after the election was over. So it's a low bar that Doug Ford had to jump over, and I don't think he did jump over it. The first year was a disaster. The first year, by any measure, by any objective measure, was not good. It was all about disruption for disruption's sake. It didn't seem, I think he'd forgotten that he actually won the election. I think he thought, I'm just there to tear the barn down and I don't really have to build anything up. And, Melissa Lanceman, who's now the Thornhill MP for the Conservatives, but ran his war room, she had this line that Doug Ford is a bull who brings his own china shop with him wherever he goes. It's a great line, but that was year one. And you're right. I think in part because his chief of staff, Dean French, brought out all the worst in him. But then COVID hit. And I think he actually at that moment found a mission, which he heretofore did not have. And that's turned him around to the point where, as you pointed out in your first question, he's now been first in the polls for quite a time. And, if you are the current government, you got to like being where they are right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. If he loses, why does he lose?
Well, again, you're putting me into situations of hypothetical questions here, but
sorry. What do you think is their vulnerability, if you might say?
Well, I don't look at it that way, David. I look at it this way. I look back at 150 plus years of Ontario political history, and I find that almost every single premier that got into office by winning an election won a second election. I look at the fact that most Ontarians apparently are prepared to reward an elected premier, not somebody who inherited the office and then lost it. Ernie Eves inherited the premiership and then lost to Dalton McGuinty in his first attempt. So not that kind. But if you've won an election, for the most part, they give you a second kick at it. If they think you're doing your best, then they tend to reelect you. And at the moment, again, the polls would suggest that Doug Ford, the biggest chunk of people, not the majority, but the biggest chunk of people think he's doing his best. And that might be enough to get him over the finish line. If for whatever reason he doesn't win in June, presumably it will be because something in the next 6 months transpires to so dramatically change the narrative on him that people just say, well, we can't do that again.
Right.
And I don't know what that might be, but I'm sure going to watch for it.
Once again, I'd like to share this message from our presenting sponsor, TELUS. following the unprecedented weather events and flooding in British Columbia that sent the province into a state of emergency. TELUS believes strongly in the need to support the communities in which we live, work, and serve, and we have always strived to do so. The floods that ravaged BC last week, and which have caused so much disruption in TELUS's home province, have impacted its customers, team members, partners, and suppliers alike. So they're committing $1 million in support of British Columbia flood relief. This includes money given to the Canadian Red Cross, food banks across the province, the BC SPCA to support their work to help animals and livestock in affected areas, as well as in-kind support in health, network, and community services. TELUS remains committed to being the company that is at its best when things are at their worst, and they'll keep offering their resources and human compassion to help their fellow citizens in need. TELUS also encourages anyone wishing to join them in offering support to contact organizations registered to provide goods and services in affected areas, including the Red Cross or the BC SPCA. Do you think from a political standpoint, I know this is crass, but do you think from a political standpoint, they would welcome COVID continuing as a political issue?
I never want to ascribe those kinds of motives to anybody in office. I don't, for what it's worth, I don't think they need it. They don't need COVID to continue to be terrible to do well. There are enough people, I would suspect.
Being good for them, though, on balance, right?
Well, but the fact that he's done reasonably well during this pandemic suggests that whatever doubts people may have had about him, they seem to have made their peace with that. No, he hasn't gotten everything right. In fact, he's made some pretty bad mistakes on some things. But generally speaking, how many cases of COVID are we having in the province of Ontario these days? It's up around 700, 800 a day, something like that. I haven't checked the numbers in the last day or so, but that's what it generally is. I saw Massachusetts' numbers the other day. Massachusetts, which has a population two-thirds the size of Ontario, has thousands of cases a day, thousands. So they're smaller than us, and they're having enormously more numbers than us. So, I'll go back to Brian Mulrooney's line. I liked your interview with him, incidentally, on this podcast. That was a great interview. Brian Mulrooney always used to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. So right. Compared to the alternative, you could say Ford's doing not badly.
You've been watching the Fords for a long time, first Rob and then Doug in politics. What about Doug Ford as Premier has surprised you?
His capacity to learn. I think one of the things that, and remember, I knew his father before that too. His father, the original Doug Ford, was an MPP in Mike Harris's government.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then, of course, Rob Ford became mayor of Toronto, and now Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario. And the one thing that Doug has demonstrated, Premier Ford has demonstrated, is a capacity to learn, which I wouldn't necessarily have thought would have been part of his makeup. When he got into office, he was so determined to do things his way and just sort of stick his thumb in the eye of all of the elites who looked down on him that, governing almost became a secondary thought. It seemed to me that he just wanted to do, so much bull in a china shopping that actually governing. And somebody gave him a great piece of advice. Somebody said to him, you've won the election. You've got 4 years. Maybe it's time to do something.
Right.
And he seems to have taken that advice to heart because you see a lot less of the thumb in the eye stuff now and a lot more of the we're actually going to try to govern. So I think that capacity to learn from past mistakes, which I didn't necessarily think would be part of his makeup, has served him well.
Interesting. The NDP. So in these polls I've been referring to, I think there is an exception to what I'm going to say, but most of them show the NDP in third.
Yes.
Not out of it, but in third. What is the barrier between the NDP and the Ontario electorate? I mean, Ford, despite what we've just said, does have much of the electorate outraged. But instead of rallying behind the official opposition to replace him, they're turning in larger numbers to the Liberals. What's with the NDP? Is it the leader? Is it the party? Is there some cultural chasm? What is the problem?
This is a most interesting question because oftentimes the New Democrats run on policies that don't seem to be nationalizing the biggest banks and nationalizing the biggest, like those, they've jettisoned all those old waffle kind of programs. And you look at them and they've got a leader who's experienced, who routinely wins the poll as the most popular leader of all of those on offer. This will be her fourth attempt to win a general election. She came close last time. There was a moment, as you well remember, where the NDP were in first place. People kicked the tires on the NDP last time, and they thought about buying that car and ultimately didn't. I've talked to many New Democrats about this over the years, and for whatever reason, we appear to be still not a three-party or even four-party system in the province of Ontario, because for those who don't know, we have Conservatives in government, Liberals as the third place party, the NDP with its second best showing in official opposition, and one Green. So we have four parties represented there, and technically you could say five, because there's one defenestrated former. Say again?
Randy Hillier.
Well, no, Randy's a party of one, but I mean, there's a new party that has been created from an ejected Conservative MPP named Belinda Carr-Holios, which is the New Blue Party. And they will be running candidates in the next election. So technically, we've got five parties, represented in the legislature. But in fact, it's really a two-party plus system and has been for a very long time. The Progressive Conservative Party is the most successful political vehicle in the history of Ontario. The Liberals are actually not that close a second, although they've had success in the last 20 years with mostly under Dalton McGuinty and then again under Kathleen Wynne. The NDP have won one election in 154 years. One election. And I'm sorry to say this, Premier Ray, but it was a bit of a fluke. A perfect storm had to happen for that to win. Right. That perfect storm happened last time, David, as you well know. The Liberal support disappeared entirely. A Conservative leader.
They should have won.
They certainly could have won, particularly given how little appeal Doug Ford as a leader had with the people of Ontario. So there's just something about the party that people are not yet prepared to trust them again with the keys to Queen's Park. I'm fascinated of what that might be. It may well be that the people just don't see them as a potential. They like them as the conscience of the legislature, but they don't necessarily see them as a party, as a government in waiting.
Yeah, it's interesting because, in the other provinces where they're that kind of strong, they have crossed that bridge. Even in Alberta, they have crossed that bridge. But they can't cross it, seemingly, in Ontario, no matter what they do to their platform. I mean, in 2014, you could make an argument that if there was room for a female leader to win on a left of center platform, you could ask yourself why it wasn't Andrea Horwath in 2014. But they ran on a very middle of the road, almost populist platform, trying to downplay any ideological edge that they might have. And that hurt them. So it's not, it's not like you can just say, well, they need to de-radicalize, because there's really nothing radical about them.
No, they ran on I well remember when they introduced the tax break for small business in that election campaign. And I had New Democrats calling me saying, what the hell are we doing? We're not the party of small business. Right. But of course, Andrea Horwath very much wanted to do what you just suggested. She wanted to take the radicalization out of the platform, and she wanted to run on something more moderate, very much like Tom Mulcair did federally. And we know that there's just a huge chunk, not only of the caucus, but of the base of the NDP that doesn't want any truck or trade with that. They want to be a more leftist party. They want to be the furthest option on the left for the electorate. And I think definitely under Kathleen Wynne, the Liberals were the more left-wing party in that election campaign, and Kathleen Wynne won a majority government doing it.
Spare a thought again this week for British Columbia. As I said last pod, it's pretty clear people in that province are paying a heavier price for climate change than some of the rest of us. Last summer, BC suffered some of the hottest temperatures in the world. The heat and resulting fires killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest. Then, just months later, an atmospheric river channeled a foot of rain into the province. Tens of thousands of British Columbians have been forced to flee their homes. The flooding has killed livestock and triggered deadly landslides, and this past week brought another wave of heavy rain. Our sponsor, CN, has thrown itself into relief efforts. The railway has extensive operations in the province, and many of its employees live in the interior. CN has pledged $100,000 to the Red Cross. It has been working with provincial emergency management officials, organizing evacuations, delivering medical equipment, and escorting healthcare workers to stranded areas. Still, the flood closed roads and rail lines between the Lower Mainland and the rest of Canada for days. In many ways, the area remains isolated, and the rest of Canada remains largely cut off from a crucial seaport and the natural resources we depend on from BC. It all just emphasizes how vital our supply chains are to our way of life and how crucial CN is to maintaining them. In 2020, CN moved 300 million tons of cargo along nearly 20,000 route miles from coast to coast and deep into the United States. It actually set a record last year for moving grain out of the prairies. But when trains stop running, containers of material crucial to the livelihoods of producers, manufacturers, and retailers start piling up. That's been happening in the past few weeks. There have been knock-on effects across the country that we are all feeling. CN takes its job as Canada's main trade enabler seriously. Its employees are working night and day to restore full service in BC. Weather permitting, some normalcy should return in a few days. So you said it's Horwath's fourth crack. The federal Conservatives are tearing apart O'Toole after one election, and they got rid of Scheer after one election. And the federal New Democrats, you mentioned Mulcair, they didn't have any issue getting rid of Mulcair after one election. What is it about the culture of the Ontario New Democrats that they leave a leader in place for so many elections in a row?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Number one, the expectation of victory is not there with the Ontario NDP in the way that it is with, say, the federal Conservative Party. So that's number one, first and foremost. And number two, I think you have to allow for the fact that, and you know, here's an example from your past you would well understand. There's no Paul Martin waiting in the wings, sort of nipping at Andrea Horwath's heels, saying, I've got this kind of alternative base of the party just raring to go, just waiting for you to slip up, after which, you know, it's us. Of course, there are rumblings. Of course, there are people who, you know, people like me in the press gallery look at and say, oh, that's, you know, if and when Andrea Horwath decides to step aside, that's the next leader. But everybody is very, very calm about the way that happens in the New Democratic Party. There are not the same kind of putschs in place. So I think that's why.
Okay. The Liberals are looking pretty good in the polls, but they have an unknown leader. They have very little money, and they have no incumbents. I think that's the first line in my Wikipedia entry, by the way. So do you think they can still capitalize on their challenging position in the polls, or is this illusory between election polling for them?
Well, let's put it this way. Greg Lyle, whom you well know, Innovative Research Group, a really good guy and a good pollster. Very good. I always remember his line, which is that most Ontarians, when they wake up in the morning, they go into the bathroom and they splash water on their face to wake up. When they look at themselves in the mirror, they see a Liberal. Small L. So the Ontario Liberal Party starts with the benefit that the biggest chunk of people tend to self-identify as being small L liberals. That's his view. I presume he's got research to prove that, but that's why a party that can go through the disaster that it went through in 2018, 3.5 years later, can be poised to be competitive already. Despite not having a leader with a seat in the legislature, despite not having a leader with much profile, despite probably the worst inbox of any Liberal leader in 154 years of Ontario political history. The amount of money Stephen Del Duca had to raise, the number of candidates that he had to recruit, the terrible morale of the party, talk about a big challenge. I mean, he had the biggest challenge of anybody ever.
And yet there they are. They're sort of sitting at 30%. They've got their base back. And they seem, if it's not impossible to believe that if the chips fall in a very felicitous way for the Liberal Party, it's not impossible to think that they could come first in the next election. I wouldn't say it's likely. I'm a big believer, even though many people have tried to talk me out of it. I'm a big believer in ticket splitting that happens between federal and provincial. We have Liberals in power federally. I think that hurts the potential of Liberals provincially to win a majority government. People do like to hedge their bets. It's just, to me, too much of a coincidence to see Conservatives in power at Queen's Park and Liberals in power on Parliament Hill for me to think that that's not a pattern, or vice versa for that matter. So I think that's where it's at. And here's one thing I want to know, and maybe you know the answer to this. Is Stephen Del Duca definitely running in Vaughan Woodbridge, where he has previously represented those good people in the legislature, and insists he's going to run there again, but hasn't got a nomination yet? Lots of Liberals have been nominated, but not him, not yet. Is there something going on there?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of.
I do wonder.
I would assume he's going to run there. They may want him to be the last person nominated.
Okay. Because, he lost the seat there last time, and his challenger is a cabinet minister who was reasonably popular, Michael Tobolo. So anyway, it's just something I'm curious about, but we'll see.
Do people in Ontario know who a provincial cabinet minister is?
Overwhelmingly, no. And I was going to say they usually know the name of the Minister of Finance, but this current Minister of Finance has such a difficult name to pronounce, even his premier can't pronounce it properly. And I don't say that to be critical, because I know every journalist in the province has screwed up Peter Bethlen-Falvey's name as well. It's a tough name to say. But yeah, I think they know who Caroline Mulrooney is. I think a lot of them know who Vic Fideli is. I think a lot of them know who Lisa MacLeod is, some of the ones who've been around for a while. And I think they're getting to know who Peter Bethlen-Falvey is. They just can't say his name.
Right. I was wondering, I think it's kind of a marginal advantage. It's not insignificant, but it's right.
Yeah.
I don't know how big a deal it is. Was Ford the first opposition leader to win an election on his first try?
Well, let's remember, he was never opposition leader, right? He never had a seat when he won the leadership. So technically he wasn't. The short answer is no. Bob Rae was the opposition leader in 1987 when he became premier in 1990.
But that wasn't his first run.
Oh, that wasn't his first run. That's fair. Well, David Peterson was the opposition leader in 1985, and it was his first run. Now, technically, you could say he didn't win that election because he came second, but it's a very strange way of saying you didn't win the election when you end up being premier 6 weeks later. So I think there's that. But I take your point. It's hard to go from first-time opposition leader to victory in your first shot. Tim Hudak didn't do it. Dalton McGuinty didn't do it. And you go back through history. You're right. Hard to do.
Yeah. Harris had to go through an election. McGuinty had to go through an election.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know how much of a factor that is, but it's just another challenge for Stephen Del Duca.
I would assume that Liberals in Ontario are thinking to themselves, we have 7 seats right now, right? 7 out of 124. We're a long way away from forming government. A lot of good things have to happen for us to win in Stephen Del Duca's first shot. I would assume they're looking at it as a 2-election project. They'll never admit that, of course, but I would assume that. And, some of them in their most fantastic dreams are thinking, I wonder if we can do what Justin Trudeau did, which is go from third to first in one election. Mike Harris did it. Again, not on his first chance, but Mike Harris went from third to first in 1995. Justin Trudeau did it in 2015. Not impossible, but when Mike Harris did it, it hadn't happened in 70 plus years. And when Justin Trudeau did it, it had never happened before. So it's hard to do.
I argued in 2014, 2015 in the federal Liberal case that it was essential that we be competing to win, because there were so many people in the country that were so determined to get rid of Stephen Harper that if we didn't look like we could win, they would vote for the other party that looked like it could win. And that you first had to win this primary with the NDP to be the people that looked like they could beat Harper. I could argue that the same thing is true provincially now, that the Liberals can't look at this as a two-step process where we get ahead of the NDP and get back into opposition, because I think there's a good chance that vote that looks split right now between the Liberals and the NDP will coalesce behind the people most likely to beat Ford.
I agree with you. And one of the things that I find most intriguing in the countdown to the next election is what happens if it's a minority parliament. Now, normally speaking, that has been a fairly uneventful event in Ontario history. A minority parliament, whoever comes first gets the right to govern, and they look for support from either second place or third place in order to get their programs through. We know of the one notable exception in 1985 when the third place party, led by Bob Rae, decided to back the second place party, led by David Peterson. But again, that was a once in a lifetime set of circumstances where Peterson actually won more votes than the Conservatives, who won more seats. So there was a kind of and there was a 4-seat difference between first and second. So there was a legitimacy there. I'm intrigued by if the polls hang tight the way they are right now, I don't think it's enough. You'd know this better than me, but I don't know that 35% is enough for a majority government if that's what Ford ends up with on election day. In which case, who comes second, who comes third is extremely important. And the decisions between those two parties as to whether, could the Liberals actually make Andrea Horwath premier, or would that create existential problems for them in the long run? Could Andrea Horwath, understanding that the last time the NDP backed the Liberals, it meant that the NDP lost a ton of their support and were wiped out almost in 1987, when Peterson came back with the biggest majority ever. Could they do that? Or, can you imagine Andrea Horwath saying, I'm going to support Doug Ford's government bill by bill? That'd be a hard swallow too. So all of the prospects around all of that are very intriguing to me.
It's a Hobson's choice. If you're the Liberal Party, if you were in that circumstance, if you were to put Ford into office, you would be breaking faith with most of the people who voted for you.
Totally.
In the election. And if you were to put the NDP into office, you likely consign your party to the dustbin of history. So it's not a good situation for them to be in third place. Very bad situation for them to be in the next election.
Yep.
I am full of humility as I speak about provincial politics and about the situation of the current Liberal Party. The next election, we touched on this earlier, the next election could still well be about COVID. And, I think that the first lockdown, the beginning of COVID, was a tremendous opportunity, and I think he took full advantage of it for Ford to completely recast and reshape his relationship with the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
And he was able to wash all of the Dean French off him with those empathetic, seemingly human performances as premier. However, I sense incredible fatigue in the population. Maybe there shouldn't be fatigue. Trevor Noah has this line, and it's more about the States than about Canada. Trevor Noah has this line where he said, "My God, some of us masked, most of us social distanced when it was convenient, and half of us got the vaccine. What more will it take?" But nonetheless, I sense real fatigue. And if there had to be another lockdown, boy, I would be scared of the politics of that if I was the government.
Yeah, I think that's well argued. Having said that, people don't blame Doug Ford, obviously, for the fact that we have a global pandemic happening right now. They will certainly take issue and have taken issue with some of the decisions he's made along the way. A full-blown lockdown now, nearly 2 years into this thing, would certainly be received by the electorate. I quite agree with you, differently than it was 2 years ago when we were trying to put this thing to rest. But now here comes Omicron. And how much does that reset the whole calculus around all of this? It seems to me, David, that people at the beginning of this whole thing were prepared to give the Ford government a great deal of latitude, because after all, they knew that he didn't come into office with epidemiological credentials. to deal with a global pandemic. So they gave him a wide berth to sort of figure it out as he went along. And along the way, he made some, well, let's just say some confusing calls, some calls that didn't make a heck of a lot of sense. Allowing big box stores to be open and packed, frankly. I mean, people packed into those big box stores, but telling small businesses along Yonge Street in Toronto, for example, you guys have all got to be closed. Even though you can only fit, 5 to 10 people in these stores anyway. And even though they'd spent thousands of dollars putting up the kind of equipment you need to keep the places safer, he was telling them they had to stay closed. I mean, he's supposed to be the premier for small business, and I never really quite understood that. And I bet you a lot of other people didn't either. And then there was that other time when he tried to, shut down all the parks, and he tried to get people back into a second lockdown, and the public simply revolted. They weren't about to have it. And I remember he made the announcement on a Friday afternoon, and I think by Saturday afternoon, he'd done a complete 180 and said, okay, I hear you. I was wrong. We'll stand down on a lot of the closing all the parks and putting all the kids inside and all that. Because it didn't seem to make sense. So, you've got to give him this, in as much as when they have made decisions that appear to be inexplicable, in the main, they've rethought it and come out the other side with something that seemed to get more public buy-in. But I don't know how often you want to play that record, because, the grooves in that record can get awfully skippy after a while.
They had a very weird process that led into those kinds of decisions, with seemingly marathon caucus and cabinet meetings.
Yep.
Hours and hours where people were debating the detail of this. Why are they operating through a process like that?
I think one of the biggest
that consult so widely on these things to keep their caucus together, or why are so many people involved in these decisions?
Well, I think one of the, and normally you would say this is not a problem, but in this case, it might be a problem. One of the issues for the current Progressive Conservative Caucus is that they actually have some they of course have their base of support in rural Ontario, but they've got a fairly decent representation in exurban and suburban and even urban Ontario. And that means that those caucus meetings, when you've got people in I'm just going to pluck this out of thin air, Nipissing, Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, saying, we have no COVID out here. Why am I telling my constituents they've got to shut everything down when nothing's happening out here? As opposed to, your members from, the inner suburbs of Toronto who say, oh my goodness, we're really in trouble here and we need a lot more support. You can understand why those meetings would go on a very long time. So normally it's a great thing to have representation from all parts of the province. This might be one of those instances where, coming to a consensus when the reality on the ground is so different, that's harder.
If COVID isn't the issue of the election campaign, cost of living will be.
Right.
And voters don't differentiate between levels of government. And if the federal Conservatives think cost of living is a problem for Trudeau, it's a problem for Ford.
Yeah.
And he's a populist. Do you think we're going to see some interesting responses this spring in a budget to cost of living?
They surely know this. And so it's impossible for me to believe that there won't be something there. We haven't had a budget come out yet. And already the Ford government has pledged to spend billions upon billions of dollars on a new highway north of Toronto, the 413 it's going to be called.
Yeah.
For a highway where the jury is really out on whether it's needed at all. And the premier has apparently already decided it's not going to be a toll highway because he's very nervous about the whole issue of affordability. Now, if you wanted to build that kind of highway for a relatively small number of drivers who would use it a lot, if you're the finance minister, you might like the idea of putting tolls on that thing because that thing could make you a lot of money. I mean, the 407, which was a toll highway before the Harris government sold it, made a fortune for the province of Ontario. And now it doesn't. And they sold it for not very much money. And it's, that's a great example from history that this government doesn't appear to be learning from. But again, we get back to the issue you just raised, affordability. Can a government looking for votes in the exurbs of the province of Ontario go to the people saying, we're going to spend billions upon billions to build this highway, but you're going to have to pay to use it? I don't know. That's a tough lift these days.
A very tough lift. I think on the highway stuff, I think they're going for something cultural. And I'm probably influenced. I had this Chris Arnauty guy on the podcast last
I
week.
heard him. Yep.
We were talking about, sort of how people make political decisions. And to my ear, and maybe it's because I'm from Saskatchewan and I've still got that Saskatchewan thing, but to my ear, when the Liberals and the New Democrats talk about climate change action, and when they talk about public transit, sometimes they sound to me like they think I shouldn't be driving my car. Right? And I think that most people who have cars like their cars and like driving cars. And if they sense that the agenda of the parties is anti-car and that their ultimate objective is to cram us all onto trains, that's a pretty big cultural divide, I think. And if you're a suburban person, you're a driver.
I think no question in my mind, you are right about that. And Doug Ford mentioned it when he made the announcement on the 413. He said, all of you people who live in cities, maybe it's okay, fine, all well and good for you to bicycle wherever you want to go. But for people who live out here, a car isn't just a means of going from A to B. A car is freedom. It's a bigger thing. It's a more existential thing. And no doubt, I live in the middle of Toronto. I live in Midtown. To me, a car, more often than not, is a nuisance. The streets around where I lived are just packed all the time. And part of it because the number of streets are there's just too few given the traffic. And part of it is because there's a $6 billion LRT being built about 200 yards north of my home. So everything is congested and the whole area is a construction site right now. So for someone where I live, the car, in some respects is an enemy. It prevents me from getting to where I want to go. Out where they want to build the 413, the car is freedom. And I'm absolutely with you. They're not going to be cycling there. You're not going to be building LRTs up there. You're not going to be building subways up there. But yes, Liberals and New Democrats have to figure out how to do that messaging where they don't come across as being anti-freedom, anti-choice, anti-mobility, and yet still pro-climate change. Tough one.
Right. You got to endorse electric cars, which Del Duca has obviously done with his incentive program. But you've got to leave people with their cars. If people think that the fight against climate change entails giving up my car, the fight against climate change just got a lot more difficult.
Oh, it's lost. You just simply cannot make that argument for huge numbers of people in great swaths of this province. Hamilton's a city of 500,000 people, my hometown. The province is going to build and pay for an LRT, and still half the people in the city don't want it. Right? Half the people think it's inimical to the way that city functions. So if it doesn't work in a city of 500,000 people, less than an hour from Toronto, how's that argument going to work outside the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area? Well, it's not.
Okay. While we're on highways, what do you know about the relationship between these people that own the 407 and the government? And by that, I don't mean the Ford government as if there's some nefarious political connection. I'm not alleging that. But when the Liberals were in office, I was told that contract was so airtight and the penalties for breaking it were so punitive that it was inconceivable. Because it's obviously a terrible deal for the province and you would break it if you could.
Yeah.
Somehow. And apparently we can't. So then this issue comes along about revenues, and the government suddenly has leverage over these people and decides not to exercise it. Why is that?
It's a wonderful question. And the short answer is, I don't know, but I can speculate. Apparently right now, the details around this are such that the people who own this highway owe us $1 billion. Like they're supposed to pay the Treasury of Ontario $1 billion. I don't know where I'm from. That's real money. Think about how many MRIs or how many schools you could build. Or the list of things you could do with $1 billion is almost infinite. The Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario tells us we are $1.3 billion worth of diagnostic testing in arrears
because all of our ICUs and so much of our hospital resources got redirected to COVID. There are people who've been waiting for whatever, MRIs, CT scans, diagnostic tests, who haven't got them. We have people who have died, David, during this pandemic.
We're not talking about knee replacements here. As important as that is, I'm not even dismissing a knee replacement. No, we're talking about cancer treatments and things, right?
That's exactly right. And there are people who have died prematurely who need not have died because they were not able to access those tests because the whole healthcare system had pivoted to take care of COVID. So $1 billion, you don't think that'd come in handy right about now? You're damn right it would. And yet, the government has decided to forgive the owners of the 407 that penalty. And I don't understand it, except for the fact that apparently one of the biggest Canadian pension organizations is the majority owner of that highway. And I presume made an argument to them at some point saying, if you penalize us this $1 billion, this will affect the pensions of so many everyday Canadians that it will be financially not to your advantage at the end of the day. I can only assume that's the argument that's been used, because otherwise, to me, it makes no sense. I remember when the Liberals were in power as well, and there were opportunities to go get fines from what was then a Spanish consortium, which owned the 407. And once again, the government, in that case, a Liberal government, stood down and decided not to go after it. It's inexplicable to me. I don't get it. There's so much about that I don't get. The deal to sell it was terrible. The contract to continue it seems to be terrible. Why they haven't lowered the tariffs on it so that more people can drive on it affordably and maybe obviate the need to build the 413, I don't understand that either. You're right. There's a million questions around this I don't get.
I would just love to get all of the semi-trailers onto the 407.
Wouldn't that be great?
Leave the 401 for cars.
Yep.
Yeah. What are the political reasons, and it can only be political, why the government is dragging its feet on the child care deal? I don't see them winning a public relations battle. Like, it's not like there's a public stake in the ground, like they're screwing us on money, or I don't see what they're fighting for. So I don't see how they're extracting political advantage out of waiting. Now, I'm a person who thinks that the political advantage out of childcare is minimal to begin with. So I'm not saying that this is going to hurt them in any way, what they're doing. I'm just curious as to why they're doing it.
I can only think of one, beyond the obvious, that they would like to have this deal made closer to an election campaign because they think it might give them some glory. And you and I both understand that. I'm going to go back about 60 years right now and give you another potential explanation. And that is, back in the 1960s, the Premier of Ontario was a guy by the name of John Robarts. And when the Pearson government came forward with something called Medicare, believe it or not, Robarts was opposed. Because even though the federal government of the day was saying, Premier, we're going to pay half the shot for this. It's a 50-50 cost-sharing program. You only have to put up 50% and you get the whole thing. We're going to pay for the other half. John Robarts' response to that was, this is a Machiavellian scheme, because one day you're going to withdraw part of your support and the province of Ontario will be left to fill the gap because this is a provincial responsibility. And sure enough, Robarts was right. No one's arguing against Medicare, David. You want to get in.
In fairness, it did take 6 or 7 years before the Fed started pulling back.
Yes. Yeah. It
By
did take
1977 in the Established Programs Financing Act, they were done with 50-50.
Exactly right. And of course, today, I think the Feds pay 23% of the shot and the provinces are left to pay the rest.
Yeah.
And you wonder how crazy Robarts was to doubt the word of the federal government of the day when he said this is a Machiavellian scheme. Well, I think it's possible that kind of thinking is within the public service and the political leadership of the government of Ontario today, who want to make absolutely damn sure that whatever childcare agreement they sign with the government of Canada stays in the ratio today, or stays in the ratio in the future that it will be today. And if they're not satisfied that's going to be the case, well, I can understand their skepticism. Having said that, are they the only province left that still hasn't signed on? There might only be them in New Brunswick. It's a very small number.
Right. Yeah. it's starting to stick out like a sore thumb.
A bit.
Steve, what a great conversation. So much fun talking to you. I got it. And got a few laughs in here. So listen, before we break up, though, assuming that it's the Riders and the Ticats, 2 weeks from now, $50. You on?
I never ever bet, but if it's the Ticats and the Riders, and we're going even up, I assume, right? We're going
going even up.
All right.
Even though you've got home field advantage.
Sure. You're on for $50, but I'm sad to say, and I am going to the Ticat Argo Eastern Final at BMO Field this Sunday to cheer on my Charges. But they ought to be a 10-point underdog in Toronto this weekend, simply because, David, I think you need an offense to win a football game, particularly at this time of year. And until we find an offense, I just am not going to believe. So I'm from Missouri on this one. I'm from Hamilton, but I'm from Missouri on this.
You got lots of weapons. Mazzoli's a weapon. Banks is a weapon. Jackson's a weapon.
Yeah, but this seems to be an era of international disarmament, so I'm not impressed with our weapons lately.
Listen, Steve, thank you for coming on. You're such a fair and objective. I mean, you have a reputation over the course of your working life for being the most fair, the most objective, the most balanced person in Canadian journalism. So thanks for coming on and talking a little bit and showing us a little bit of leg about what you think about these various things. And you're such a fount of knowledge. So thanks for doing it. Really appreciate it.
It's been great to spend this time with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. And of course, I'd like to thank all you Herle Burlyites out there for tuning in for another week. Come back next week, more football.